You've probably heard the term Dark Ages tossed around like it's shorthand for 1,000 years of absolute misery. The image is familiar: peasants wallowing in mud, everyone dying at 30, castles looming with suspiciously clean stone walls, and knights galloping across Europe like they're late for a Renaissance fair. It's the kind of gloomy shorthand that makes you think people just sat around in candlelit huts waiting for the Renaissance to finally arrive and save them. But reality wasn't exactly a cinematic apocalypse. It wasn't a pitch-black void of culture either. Instead, it was something a little less dramatic, but arguably worse. It was exhausting. Imagine not a dramatic free fall into barbarism, but rather the daily grind turned up to 11. You weren't sprinting through fire and brimstone. You were trudging through ankle-deep mud, forever tired, forever hungry, forever itchy. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't even properly dark. It was just tiring. So let's say you wake up one morning in the year 800, somewhere in the middle of Europe. The sun isn't up yet, but you are. Why? Because you don't have shutters. You don't even have glass windows. You have a hole in the wall that lets in the air, the bugs, and the faint grey dawn. Curtains? Don't make me laugh. At best, you've got a piece of cloth that smells faintly of smoke, because everything smells faintly of smoke. It doesn't matter if you're a peasant or a minor lord, your home interior doubles as a campfire memory. The first sensation you notice isn't light, but cold. Stone, wood and straw don't retain warmth the way you might hope. Your blanket is rough wool that scratches more than it comforts. You're not cozy. You're wrapped in the medieval equivalent of a doormat. The floor is dirt, uneven and hard. If you're lucky, there are rushes spread out across it, plants scattered to soften the ground and absorb the waste that inevitably accumulates. These rushes are changed maybe twice a year. In other words, congratulations, you are sleeping on compost. Breakfast doesn't exactly motivate you out of bed either. There's no coffee, no warm croissant, no polite cappuccino froth waiting on the table. Instead you get bread, so hard it could double as a blunt weapon. Maybe some weak beer, because water is often questionable at best. Milk, if you're in a dairy-friendly area. But don't imagine it fresh and pasteurized. Imagine it slightly sour, carrying the faint memory of the cow's last few meals. And butter? Well, that's for feast days. Most mornings, you gnaw on dry bread and wash it down with something tepid. Energy drink of champions. Of course your stomach isn't the only thing to deal with. Hygiene waits patiently in the background. Or rather, the absence of hygiene does. Washing your face means splashing cold water from a bucket you filled yesterday. Soap exists, but it's coarse and made with animal fat. Perfume exists too, but unless you're extremely wealthy, you don't get any, so you smell like yesterday's smoke, your livestock, and whatever the rushes have been fermenting into under your feet. Modern deodorant commercials don't really prepare you for this vibe. If you're already tired at this point, well, you'd better wake up, because the day hasn't even started. Remember, there's no 9 to 5 office schedule. There's daylight and there's darkness, and your day is chained to both. If the sun is up, you're working. If the sun goes down, you're squinting at the firelight and trying not to fall asleep face first into whatever task you didn't finish. Medieval insomnia wasn't a personal choice, it was a lifestyle. And here's where the exhaustion really shows itself. You don't have one job, you have every job. You might be tending crops, mending clothing, fixing thatched roofs, hauling water, chopping firewood, and still expected to show up for whatever local lord needs from you that week. The medieval economy isn't industrialized. There are no convenient shops down the street. You are the factory, the grocery store, and the repair service. If you can't make it, you probably don't have it, and that includes food. Now let's be fair. Not everyone in the so-called Dark Ages was starving constantly. People could and did grow enough to survive most years, but survival wasn't guaranteed, and it was always precarious. Harvest failed? Congratulations, you're fasting, but not in the trendy intermittent way. This is the kind of fasting that teaches you which weeds are edible, and which will just make your stomach regret its life choices. The margins of survival were thin, and you lived always aware that next winter might just stretch a little too long. But don't picture yourself entirely miserable. The medieval brain was astonishingly adaptable. This was just normal. You didn't complain about the lack of central heating, because you didn't know it existed. You didn't write angry letters about slow Wi-Fi because you didn't even have an alphabet until the church taught you some Latin prayers. Your world was small, local, and tiring, but it was yours. And speaking of the church, Here's where some of your hours vanish. You might think your life is mostly ploughing and sowing, but religion eats time like a medieval Pac-Man. Bells ring, priests preach, fast days multiply, and suddenly you're calculating which meals you're allowed this week and which you aren't. Lent isn't just cut out sugar for a bit. It's more like hope you like dried fish because you'll be seeing a lot of it. Religion gave meaning, sure, but it also filled your calendar with obligations that made work harder, not easier. The irony is that while Hollywood loves to show the Middle Ages as a time of wild sword fights, your arms are far more likely to ache from carrying buckets than swinging blades. Combat, rare, chores, eternal. Even if you're part of the knightly class, you're not galloping around in constant battle. You're probably just arguing over land rights, managing servants, or writing stern letters in bad Latin. For all its reputation for violence, medieval life mostly involved grinding fatigue rather than glorious duels. And then there's the soundscape. Forget the silence of an enchanted forest. Your medieval morning is full of animals. Chickens squawk, pigs grunt, cows bellow, and dogs bark at everything that moves. Add to that the clang of hammers from the blacksmith's shed, the murmur of voices, and the occasional ring of church bells. If you imagined monks chanting in serene harmony, yes, that happens too. But it echoes through walls that leak wind and rain. The soundtrack of the Dark Ages wasn't solemn Gregorian perfection. It was barnyard chaos set to the beat of human labour. Smells, a delicate bouquet of smoke, manure, sweat, and occasionally bread baking. Not terrible if you're used to it. Horrific if you're not. Think of the worst subway ride you've ever had during summer. Now stretch that odour across every waking hour of your life. That's the air freshener of your world. The funny thing is, people weren't necessarily depressed about all this. They were just tired. Fatigue was the baseline. When survival is work, and work never ends, you don't look for happiness in leisure. Leisure is basically a saint's feast day, when you're allowed a bit of meat and maybe some dancing. Everything else is one more chore before you can collapse on your compostable mattress. And that's the great contradiction of the so-called Dark Ages. They weren't dark because people were hopeless. They were dark because candles are expensive. They were exhausting because existence demanded constant effort. Every mouthful of food, every scrap of clothing, every log of firewood required time, sweat, and patience. There were no shortcuts. And even when you had enough to scrape by, you were always one step away from hunger, cold, or illness. Not a thrilling apocalypse, just tired. As the day drags on, you begin to notice something else. The rhythm of exhaustion isn't just physical, it's social too. Every interaction is loaded with obligation. You owe rent to your lord, tithes to the church, service to your neighbours, and favours to just about anyone who helped you last harvest. Freedom, as you imagine it now, didn't really exist. Instead, you lived inside a web of duties, expectations, and unwritten rules. You couldn't just call in sick. There was no sick leave. If you didn't show up to your field didn't grow. If you didn't show up for the harvest, your neighbours noticed. And if you didn't show up for your lord, well, best not to find out. The irony is that the ruling classes weren't resting easy either. A minor noble might have servants, but he also had rivals. He spent as much time worrying about borders, disputes, and feuds as you did about weeds. Being a medieval boss wasn't sipping wine and watching peasants toil. It was a never-ending balancing act of alliances, marriages, and debts, and all of it enforced through endless negotiation, sometimes by sword, but mostly by complaint and counter-complaint. Imagine a corporate job without email, just handwritten gripes delivered by exhausted messengers. By mid-morning, your body already feels heavy. That's not surprising considering nutrition is thin, protein is rare, calories are inconsistent, and vitamins are an invisible lottery you didn't know you were playing. The bread you ate earlier, it's coarse, made of whatever grain could be scrounged up. Sometimes it's rye, sometimes barley, sometimes wheat, if you're lucky. It comes with bits of grit baked in from the grinding stone, which means your teeth wear down faster than you'd like. A dentist doesn't exist. Toothache is just another flavour of exhaustion you'll carry with you. And then there's illness. Small infections don't vanish, they fester. A scratch from a rusty blade can become a long-term problem. Coughs echo through your home, and no one thinks to cover their mouth. Medicine isn't absent, but it's herbal, experimental, and often mixed with prayer. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you want a doctor, you'd better hope you live near a monastery. and even then, the treatment might involve bleeding or purging. Recovery, when it comes, is more likely from luck and your immune system than expertise. The afternoon passes slowly. Fields need ploughing, clothes need mending, animals need tending, children are everywhere, but don't imagine happy, carefree children skipping around with wooden toys. They're working too as soon as they can stand, herding geese, fetching water, guarding the crops. Childhood as you picture it, with school, games and imagination, is mostly reserved for the lucky sons of nobles, who might be taught to read or trained to fight. For most, it's just an early start on being tired. At some point you might find yourself at the village well, waiting your turn. It's the medieval water cooler, where news trickles as slowly as the bucket. Gossip spreads here. Who had a baby, who lost a cow, who got fined for stealing wood. It's social life, but it's also politics. In a world without newspapers, every rumour counts. And yes, everyone smells like damp wool and livestock. You don't notice, because so do you. Then evening approaches, and with it the one meal of the day that feels almost satisfying. Maybe some stew thickened with barley or peas, maybe bread again, but this time softened in broth. If the season is generous, a bit of pork or chicken finds its way into the pot. On rare days, you might even have cheese or eggs. You don't eat quietly though. The whole family, and sometimes extended family, crowd around the hearth. The smell of smoke clings to everything. The flicker of firelight dances across faces, and the stew tastes better than it should, mostly because you're just desperately hungry. As darkness settles, you realize that sleep is coming, whether you like it or not. There's no nightlife here. There's no nightlife here. There's no reading lamp to keep you awake. Candles are expensive. Oil is limited and torches are smoky. So you crawl back to your straw mattress early, not because you want to, but because there's little else to do. You might share that bed with siblings, parents, or even livestock, depending on the season and the size of your house. Privacy isn't part of your vocabulary. If you're lucky, everyone is too tired to snore. And so your day closes much as it began, with the scratch of wool on your skin, the faint itch of straw beneath you, the sound of animals outside, and the lingering ache of a body that has worked too much and rested too little. Tomorrow will look much the same. The work won't end, the obligations won't pause, the exhaustion will deepen into routine, and still, you'll wake when the sun wakes you, because that's what you've always known. So no, the Dark Ages weren't a void of culture. They weren't even especially dark. They were just one long, ongoing lesson in how tired a human being can be while still managing to carry on. Civilization survived not because people were dramatic heroes, but because they were too stubborn to collapse. And if you had to live through it, you'd find yourself not dazzled by the mystery of medieval life, but quietly asking the same question every peasant must have asked at some point. Is it bedtime yet? When you hear the phrase Dark Ages, one of the first images that pops into your head is probably intellectual darkness. You might picture peasants staring blankly at a plough, incapable of thought, while monks scribble nonsense in Latin somewhere off stage. Hollywood has done its best to convince you that medieval Europe was 1,000 years of forgetting how to read until some Italian genius rediscovered books in 1450. But that's not quite true. Knowledge didn't vanish. It just became heavy. And by heavy, I mean exhausting. Imagine living in a world where the smartest person you know might be able to read, but only in a language you don't speak. Imagine schools that don't exist unless you're in the church. Imagine that every scrap of paper costs as much as a week's wages, and the only way to copy it is to spend another week bent over in candlelight, slowly wrecking your eyesight. Knowledge wasn't gone, it was just hard labour. So let's picture it. You're in a monastery somewhere in Francia, maybe around the year 900. Outside, peasants are tilling fields, chickens are chasing bugs, and someone is inevitably stepping in manure. Inside, you're surrounded by rows of books, except rows might mean a dozen, and books means hefty slabs of parchment chained to shelves. Each one smells faintly of ink and sheep, because yes, that's what they're made of. You don't leaf through casually. You unbuckle, unfold, and lift. These aren't bedtime novels. They're medieval gym weights disguised as reading material. And what's in them? Not ignorance, but repetition. Aristotle, copied and recopied. The Bible in Latin, copied again. Commentaries on Aristotle, and commentaries on the commentaries. If you're looking for originality, you'll be tired before you find it. Medieval knowledge was cumulative, but it was also conservative. Innovation didn't vanish, but it wasn't celebrated either. The goal was to preserve what little you had, not risk losing it. Every page written was a small insurance policy against the chaos of fire, war, or rats. This is the part no one tells you. Reading itself could be exhausting. For starters, punctuation wasn't standardized. Words often ran together, no spaces in between, like an eternal medieval capture test. Want to read aloud? Good luck figuring out where the sentence ends. And spelling? Forget consistency. You might see the same word spelled 3 different ways on the same page. It wasn't that people didn't know better, they just hadn't agreed on a system yet. So every page was a fresh puzzle. Outside the cloister, things weren't much simpler. If you were a peasant, literacy wasn't part of your job description, but that didn't mean you were stupid. You could still keep track of debts, gossip, and weather patterns. You could still navigate a field, repair a cart, or haggle at the market. Knowledge in the Dark Ages wasn't written in books. It was written in calloused hands, aching backs, and oral memory. Want to know when to plant? Ask the neighbour with the best harvest. Want to know how to fix a thatched roof? Watch your uncle do it. It was a university of exhaustion, and every diploma came with sore muscles. But let's return to the myth that Europe forgot science. It didn't. It just couldn't afford to indulge in it much. Arabic scholars in Baghdad were translating Greek texts, experimenting with medicine, and charting stars. In China, inventors were tinkering with gunpowder and printing. In Europe, you were busy making sure your single candle didn't burn down the house. Knowledge advanced where conditions allowed, where survival was consumed every hour. Progress slowed, not from stupidity, from exhaustion. And yet, learning did exist, even outside monasteries. By the 12th century, universities were sprouting up. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. They weren't modern campuses with student cafes and Wi-Fi. They were lecture halls where professors droned in Latin, and students furiously copied, often without understanding, just to own a version of the text. Imagine paying a fortune to sit in a freezing hall while someone reads aloud for hours in a language you barely follow. It wasn't enlightenment, it was sleep deprivation with tuition. Of course, even having knowledge didn't make life easier. Medicine, for example, was still firmly rooted in humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were sick, the cure often involved bleeding you or forcing you to vomit. Knowledge existed but applied badly. It only deepened your exhaustion. Imagine going to the doctor with a cold and they recommend leeches. You're not ignorant. You're just stuck with a medical system that hasn't quite figured out germs yet. Then there's religion, which preserved knowledge but also weighted it down with obligation. Theology was the queen of sciences, meaning every other subject bent the knee. Want to study the stars? Sure, but remember, they're there to tell God's story. Want to learn about the human body? Fine, but don't forget to write for the glory of the Creator in the margins. Curiosity was tolerated so long as it didn't wander too far. Knowledge wasn't absent, but it was fenced in, carefully guarded, and endlessly rejustified, exhausting. And yet here's the strange thing. Even with these limitations, people still found ways to innovate. Heavy ploughs appeared in northern Europe, reshaping agriculture. Water mills dotted rivers, grinding grain without human labour. Cathedrals rose, improbably tall, through sheer stubbornness and ingenuity. These weren't the works of a civilization lost in darkness. They were the works of one perpetually tired, scraping together energy to build something bigger than itself. So no, the Dark Ages weren't dumb. They were just running on low battery. Knowledge was there, tucked into parchment, whispered across fields, and argued in smoky lecture halls. But every scrap of it demanded effort, time, and patience. Learning wasn't fun, it was endurance. And if you lived in that world, you wouldn't be struck by how ignorant everyone seemed. You'd just be impressed they managed to think at all, after hauling water, feeding livestock, and sitting through a 3-hour sermon in Latin. Of course, not all knowledge in the Middle Ages came from books or lectures. Much of it came from lived experience, passed down in fragments that never made it into parchment. Farmers knew the sky, the soil, and the seasons better than any philosopher. Craftsmen, often illiterate, carried secrets in their hands: the angle of a chisel, the rhythm of hammering, the right way to dye cloth so the colour lasted more than a few months. This wasn't ignorance. It was practical intelligence, accumulated slowly, repeated endlessly, and sometimes guarded like treasure. Guilds in towns and cities began to form around this idea that knowledge was power, but power meant labor. A shoemaker's son became a shoemaker because the family could afford no other route, and because each trade took years of training to master. Apprenticeship was an education system in its own right: long hours, strict discipline, and very little freedom. You didn't just learn a craft, you learned how to live within the expectations of a master, of a workshop, of a community. Again, not dramatic, just exhausting. And if you did want to rise higher, if you dreamed of leaving the forge or the field for something loftier, the gatekeepers were literacy and Latin. Without them, universities were closed to you. Without them, the world of theology, law, or medicine remained out of reach. For most people, those gates never opened. For the few who did enter, the work inside was no less wearying. Pages of Aristotle, legal codes in cramped script, debates over fine points of doctrine, all of it spoken in a language most people never heard in daily life. To study was to live in a second world, parallel to your own, but one that demanded every ounce of mental energy. And still, knowledge trickled in from elsewhere, bringing both curiosity and confusion. Merchants arriving from the east carried not only spices and silk, but also stories of strange medicines, strange stars, strange ideas. Translators in Sicily and Spain introduced works of Greek science preserved by Arabic scholars. Suddenly, a Latin student in Paris might be puzzling over geometry diagrams that originated centuries earlier in Alexandria. The flow of knowledge was never smooth. It was fits and starts, misunderstandings and revisions. Each new idea had to be wrestled into Latin, argued over, and often bent to fit theological frameworks. Progress, yes, but progress in slow motion. And let's not forget the mental fatigue of living in a world where superstition sat side by side with observation. You might know that planting at a certain moon phase brought better harvests, but you also believed charms could ward off sickness. You might recognize herbal remedies that soothed pain, while also praying to a saint for relief. Knowledge wasn't neatly divided into science and nonsense. It was a tangled rope pulled in many directions at once. And sorting it out wasn't easy. It wore people down. So when you step back and picture the intellectual life of the so-called Dark Ages, don't imagine a vacuum. Imagine a crowded desk, covered in half-finished notes surrounded by muttering monks, with peasants outside arguing over the weather. Imagine progress being made in inches, not miles, every scrap of learning purchased with long nights, cramped hands, and tired minds. The light of knowledge was there, it just flickered, because keeping it burning was such hard work. When you imagine the Middle Ages, you probably see castles silhouetted against dramatic skies, knights in polished armour, riding noble steeds, and lords dining at long oak tables while minstrels strum away in the background. A picturesque blend of romance, chivalry, and candlelight dinners. In reality, those castles were drafty stone refrigerators. The knights were perpetually broke and sore, and the lords were too busy balancing debts and feuds to enjoy the roast venison in front of them. The glamour of medieval high society, much like your favourite fantasy drama series, is mostly special effects. Life at the top wasn't cushy, it was just exhausting in slightly different ways. Let's start with castles. They look majestic now, perched on hills with thick walls and elegant towers. But imagine living in one. Stone doesn't insulate. The walls are damp, the floors are cold, and the only heating comes from giant fireplaces that mostly heat the people sitting closest. Your breath fogs the air in winter, and in summer, the rooms feel like storage caves. Drafts whistle through arrow slits, and tapestries do their best to hide the chill. A castle wasn't built for comfort, it was built for defense. That meant safety at the expense of warmth, convenience, or basic hygiene. Think of it as a medieval panic room, except you live there all the time. And defense wasn't optional. Nobles spent much of their energy worrying about raids, rebellions, and rival claims. The romanticized age of chivalry was in practice the age of endless squabbles. A neighboring lord might dispute a boundary. A rival cousin might want your inheritance. A passing army might demand food and shelter. If you were a noble, you weren't leisurely sipping wine, you were attending to lawsuits, arranging marriages, bribing allies, and occasionally riding out to remind everyone that your castle wasn't just decorative. Now, about those knights. You picture them in shining armour, proud and noble, champions of the weak. The truth is they were essentially medieval freelancers with crushing startup costs. Armour was expensive, a horse even more so, and maintaining both required constant income. A knight who couldn't afford his gear wasn't a knight for long, and when battles did happen, they weren't glorious duels. They were muddy brawls where visibility was poor, weapons were heavy, and exhaustion set in after about 10 minutes of serious swinging. Armour protected you, yes, but it also cooked you from the inside out. Think of wearing a sauna while sprinting across uneven ground. Heroic? Maybe. Comfortable? Never. Knights also weren't full-time warriors. Most of the time, they were managers of estates. Their battlefield was a field of wheat, their enemy the annual accounts. They collected rents, supervised peasants, and made sure the crops got harvested. Fighting was rare, but taxation was constant, and when they did fight, the cause was often depressingly mundane, enforcing feudal dues, or pressing a claim over who owned a patch of forest. The code of chivalry sounds romantic, but it was mostly paperwork dressed in armour. And then we come to noble dining, the supposed height of medieval luxury. Picture a banquet, roasted swan, spiced wine, endless platters of meat. It did happen, but only occasionally, and it was more about showing off than daily life. Day to day, noble diets weren't that different from peasants, just more meat, more spice, and more waste. Kitchens were smoky, sanitation questionable, and food preservation limited. Meat went rancid fast, spices masked the flavour. Bread, no matter your class, was still the centrepiece. Yes, you could eat better as a noble, but better often meant greasier, heavier, and less fresh. And let's not forget the etiquette. A banquet wasn't a relaxing meal. It was a social chess game, where every glance, every gift of food, every toast had political weight. You weren't just eating, you were performing. One wrong move could insult a guest, offend an ally, or signal weakness. It was like networking at a corporate gala, except the room is cold, the wine is sour, and someone might actually stab you for an offhand comment. Even leisure was exhausting. Hunting, for example, was a noble pastime. But hunting in the Middle Ages wasn't a quick walk in the woods. It was an all-day expedition with dozens of servants, packs of dogs, and elaborate rituals. By the end, you'd be cold, muddy, and bruised, having killed one deer at extraordinary expense. Yes, it reinforced social hierarchy, but it didn't leave you refreshed. And jousting? The tournaments looked glamorous, but they were brutal. Broken bones, concussions, and fatalities were common. The point wasn't sport in the modern sense. It was training for war, wrapped in pageantry. Even when you survived, you staggered away aching, not glowing. The audience might have loved the spectacle. The participants limped home wondering if the bruises were worth it. All of which is to say, the upper classes weren't living in comfort. They were living in constant stress, endless obligations, and bone-deep fatigue. Nobility meant responsibility, and responsibility meant exhaustion. The castles weren't cozy, knights weren't heroes, feasts weren't restful. Everything was work, even the parts that looked glamorous. So if you'd ever thought, well, at least if I were a lord I'd have it easy, think again, you'd just be tired in fancier clothes. If you were the one supposedly enjoying this noble life, your day would start with ledgers, not loots. The steward brings inventories that smell faintly of damp parchment and tallow, and you pretend your eyes aren't watering from the smoke clinging to everything. Salt stores are low, meaning meat preservation will be a problem, which means hunting parties that cost more than they save. The ale has gone sour in one barrel, and suspiciously thin in another, so you'll hear about it from everyone down to the scullions. Candles are counted like coins, beeswax for the chapel and high table, cheaper tallow for everyone else, and a side of rancid smell for free. Luxury, in practice, is a spreadsheet written in ink and size. Servants don't manage themselves, and hierarchy has to be maintained in tiny, exhausting ways. The chamberlain wants new linen for the guest chamber, because the last travelling knight left his hose to dry on the bed frame and dyed it blue. The constable argues for more arrows because the garrison keeps practising into the hay bales and losing shafts like boys at a fair. The reeve complains the miller takes too much toll, which means someone will stand by the hopper for a full day counting turns like an auditor with chaff in his hair. Your lady of the house runs a parallel empire: dairy, bread, brewing, linen, and a constant stream of small grievances. Power here is measured in who can end an argument before the third bell. Clothes. Those elegant garments in tapestries are maintenance projects with sleeves. Laundresses beat linen in cold water until their hands ache, then hang it where every drifting ember tries to ruin it. Wool keeps bodies warm and minds itchy, and fur-lined cloaks whisper status while also whispering fleas. A seam snaps on your riding chores, and suddenly you're negotiating with a harried tailor who wants an advance of grain. The bright trim on your surcoat fades because the dyer used impatient heat, and the next feast will display your thrift to the entire hall. Fashion is a circulating rumour, certain to cost more tomorrow. Armour, the supposed crown of glory, eats hours the way fire eats kindling. Straps stretch, rivets pop, and every edge needs oil, or the whole thing blooms with rust like unwelcome flowers. The padded gambeson under it all is a walking sponge, absorbing sweat through long drills until it smells like a stable after rain. Horses require shoes, feed, and a farrier's attention, and each one is a temperamental athlete with opinions about weather, footing, and your mood. Your squire learns knots, buckles, and the diplomatic art of pretending a dent is character. Prestige has a tack room and an invoice. Castles look tidy from a distance because the distance hides the plumbing. Garderobes drop into chutes that drop into the moat that drops into everyone's patience. On hot days, the fragrance wraps the ward like a wet blanket, and no one is brave enough to comment at the high table. The gong farmer you hired to clean it asks for hazard pay and a blessing, in that order. Wells inside the walls are defended like treasure, and you pray the bucket doesn't bring up something with legs. Even cleanliness is a siege you never quite win. Hospitality is the most exhausting display of power you'll ever perform while smiling. A royal progress appears like weather, and suddenly 200 mouths need feeding for 3 days, each one attached to a person with a title. You rearrange chambers, steal benches from the chapel, and pretend the venison wasn't stretched with pork. Seating charts are a living map of alliances and feuds, and one misplaced cousin can turn supper into a winter war. Gifts circulate like coins with memories, and you mentally calculate which cup you can afford to give away without starting a rumor. The performance ends when the torches gutter, and the servants still have 6 hours of scraping and scrubbing ahead. Justice, which sounds glorious in chronicles, is mostly arbitration, while someone's goose honks from the doorway. You hold court beneath a smoking roof, listening to cases about boundary stones that migrated in the night and pigs that forgot who owned them. Weights and measures get tested with solemn ceremony involving beans, sand, and suspicion. Fines go to the Lord, sure, but so do the complaints about those fines, which arrive with tears, curses, and petitions in dubious Latin. Your clerk keeps the seal warm and your temper warmer, because every judgment makes a friend and an enemy at once. Kings rule kingdoms, you referee a very complex barn. The money that looks solid in a chest behaves like mist in your hands. Ransoms, dowries, repairs, wages, each one arrives with a seal and a story. You borrow from merchants who talk in percentages but write in euphemisms, and the rate you aren't paying is the one that keeps you awake. Coin clipping is a rumor and a fact, and every payment requires weighing, testing, and squinting. When silver runs short, plate quietly vanishes to the goldsmith and returns in the form of solvency and regret. A banner might be silk, but the rope it hangs on is hemp and frayed. War, the career highlight in poems, is logistics in mud. Muster rolls never match the feet that show up at the gate, and 3 men claim the same spear. Everyone wants boots. No one wants to carry the spare bowstrings, and the cart axle chooses a hill to snap on. In siege, glory dissolves into counting barrels, salting meat, rationing candle ends, and telling jokes thin enough to stretch morale. Rats learn your routines, and the best archer in the garrison comes down with a cough right before dawn watch. Victory is sometimes just the other side, getting more tired first. Even quiet years creak with the strain of keeping a stone machine alive. Roofs shed tiles like autumn leaves, and each fall invites water, which invites rot, which invites a carpenter with a talent for invoices. The great hall, acoustic marvel that it is, turns every conversation into public property. Tapestries try to muffle the cold and the gossip, succeeding at neither. Children tumble through corridors like small, loud treaties, their future marriages already penciled onto other people's maps. The chapel bell rings and duty rearranges your afternoon again. So the glamour, when you do catch a glimpse of it, is a shimmer on the surface of a heavy pond. You wear the cloak, you host the feast, you lift the visor and smile for the chronicler. Underneath you are quartermaster, human resources, facilities, procurement, finance, and public relations, all while pretending your hands are clean. You are powerful in the way a millstone is powerful, by turning endlessly so that everyone else can eat. If you envy the peasant's simpler life, remember they envy your roof. Exhaustion, like rain, finds every level. And if you still want a title after this, you might also want a nap. You might think of medieval life as short, brutal, and fatal at 30. That's the usual myth. People drop dead the moment they hit what we now call middle age. But reality is, once again, less dramatic and more exhausting. Plenty of people lived into their 50s, 60s, even 70s. The catch? They got there carrying decades of untreated pain, worn-down joints, and chronic ailments that never really went away. So let's say you've survived childhood. Congratulations, already an achievement. Since infant mortality was high, if you make it to age 10, you've cleared the first big hurdle. But survival doesn't mean health. You've already got a lifetime of dental wear from gritty bread, maybe rickets from vitamin deficiency, and more parasites in your gut than you care to think about. You're alive, yes, but you're also itchy, tired, and probably limping from some untreated injury you got chasing a goose last year. Illness lurks constantly in the background. Coughs linger for months. Fevers burn and fade without explanation. A small cut on your hand could swell into something serious. Infection was a roulette wheel. Sometimes it healed, sometimes it spread, sometimes it killed. Antibiotics don't exist. An antiseptic is just a prayer whispered while rinsing with cold water. Medicine is a mix of herbs, superstition, and humours. You might get willow bark for pain relief, which actually helps. You might also get a prescription to balance your bile with leeches, which definitely doesn't. And then there's food, the double-edged sword of medieval health. On good years, you eat enough. On bad years, famine scrapes everyone raw. Malnutrition weakens bones and teeth, making recovery from any illness harder. Even nobles who ate more meat and richer food paid the price: gout, indigestion, and endless stomach complaints. A medieval banquet wasn't just a feast, it was also a guarantee of acid reflux by candlelight. Let's not forget hygiene. Bathing existed, contrary to the myth, but not daily. A hot bath meant hauling gallons of water, heating it over fire, and pouring it into a wooden tub that leaked anyway. People bathed when they could, but when they could often meant feast days or when dirt became unbearable. Soap was harsh, usually made from animal fat and lye. It cleaned, but it also stripped your skin raw. Perfume and herbs helped cover smells, but most of the time people carried the scent of smoke, sweat, and livestock. Your nose adjusted, your lungs didn't. Teeth deserve their own mention. Imagine bread ground with millstones, leaving tiny flecks of grit baked into every loaf. Each bite wore enamel away. By 30, many people had flat ground-down teeth. By 40, infections and abscesses were common. A dentist didn't pull molars with anesthetic, they yanked them out with pliers. No numbing, no antiseptic, just gritted teeth until you couldn't grit them anymore. Toothache was so constant that medieval prayers sometimes included requests for relief from it. Divine dentistry. And then there's the plague. The famous Black Death of the 14th century was the celebrity of medieval disease, killing millions in a few short years. But plague was only one guest in the crowded banquet of illness. Leprosy, smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, all made regular appearances. Each one didn't just kill, it exhausted. People carried scars, limps, and coughs for life. Entire communities lived under a permanent cloud of weakness. Childbirth, too, deserves a pause. For women, it was the single most dangerous and exhausting event of their lives. No hospitals, no sterile instruments, no pain relief, just midwives, prayers, and a lot of luck. Mortality rates were high for both mother and child, and even when it went well, the cycle repeated often. Children were survival insurance in a world of high mortality, so women bore many, with each one carving away a little more strength. Exhaustion wasn't temporary, it was generational. And yet, somehow, life went on. People still sang, worked, and laughed. Jokes existed, even about sickness. Dark humor is timeless. You might groan about gout the way you groan about a bad back today. You might complain about the fever that's going around the way we do in flu season. The difference is that for them, the flu season didn't end. It was every season. The remarkable part isn't that people died young. is that so many kept living despite the constant drag of pain and illness. They endured, because what else could they do? The body might falter, but chores still called, fields still needed tending, and lords still wanted taxes. Exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a philosophy etched into every bone and scar. So if you woke up in the so-called Dark Ages, you wouldn't marvel at the romance of medieval life. You'd probably clutch your back, rub your aching jaw and mutter something very modern in tone, if not in words. I need a day off. If sickness was a constant companion, then care was a patchwork quilt stitched from hope, habit and faith. Hospitals existed, but not as you know them. They were not sleek buildings with clean sheets and buzzing machines. They were extensions of monasteries, run by monks and nuns whose tools were prayer, broth, and whatever herbs grew in the cloister garden. To be admitted was not necessarily to be cured, it was to be sheltered, fed, and given a bed where someone might at least sit beside you while you coughed through the night. In some ways, hospitals were less about medicine and more about mercy. Special houses sprang up for lepers, those unlucky enough to bear a disease both feared and misunderstood. To be labelled a leper was to be pushed gently but firmly to the edge of society, ringing a bell or carrying a clapper to warn others of your approach. Yet even here, care was not always cruelty. Lepers' houses were endowed by nobles seeking salvation, staffed by brothers and sisters who saw service as holy. Exile was painful, yes, but it was also a community of the cast aside, caring for one another in the margins. Exhaustion here took the form of loneliness as much as illness. Communities faced epidemics together, though the strategies often made little sense by modern standards. When plague struck, towns lit bonfires to cleanse the air, rang bells louder, or organised processions, as if sheer noise could frighten away disease. Sometimes entire villages emptied themselves, fleeing into the countryside, only to carry contagion further. Quarantine was practiced in ports like Venice, but the word meant 40 days of waiting on a ship, hoping no one coughed. The principle worked, though the people inside rarely felt it as mercy. Imagine 40 days in a wooden hull that smelled of bilge, sweat and despair. Climate made its own contributions to suffering. Harsh winters or wet summers meant ruined harvests. Grain spoiled in storage, bread ran thin, and immune systems weakened. Malnutrition was not always dramatic famine. Often it was a quiet background hum of too little protein, too few greens, too many months of thin gruel. Children bore the marks in their bones. Adults carried it in aching joints and endless fatigue. Disease did not just arrive from outside. It flourished in bodies already worn down by hunger. And then there were the remedies, a mixture of keen observation and wild imagination. Some herbs genuinely helped. Yarrow for wounds, mint for digestion, willow bark for pain. Honey, applied to cuts, fought infection better than anyone realized at the time. But for every effective cure, there was another that seems absurd to modern ears. Ground emeralds to treat epilepsy, powdered stag's horn for strength, the wearing of charms against fever. Physicians prescribed recipes thick with symbolism, as much ritual as remedy. The exhausting part was not only the illness itself, but the uncertainty. You never knew if the cure in your cup would ease your pain or simply empty your purse. The wealthy sometimes fared worse for having more options. A nobleman could summon physicians who argued in Latin over his bedside, then bled him until he fainted. Too much care was sometimes as deadly as too little. Meanwhile, the poor had no physician but might stumble upon the right herb by chance, brewed by a grandmother whose knowledge came from trial, error, and whispered tradition. Survival was not a matter of intelligence. It was often sheer accident. And still, people endured. They lived with coughs that never quite went away, with joints that stiffened too soon, with teeth that throbbed until pulled, with eyes dimming by middle age. They sang anyway, prayed anyway, worked anyway. Health was not a goal, it was a moving target. If you could rise from your bed, walk to the field and complete your chores, you were well enough. Suffering was not an exception, it was the baseline. The mental toll of such a life cannot be underestimated. Imagine the constant shadow of death, the funerals that blurred together, the smell of incense, never quite leaving the air. Anxiety itself was exhausting. Every fever brought dread, every stomach cramp raised fears of pestilence. Faith soothed some of the burden. Illness could be seen as a trial, a test, or even a cleansing. But for many, the exhaustion was not just in the body, it was in the spirit, worn thin by years of fear, loss, and resignation. So when you think of the Middle Ages, don't picture them as uniformly short-lived. Picture them as long-lived in struggle. Bodies did not simply break and vanish. They carried on, limping, coughing, aching, and surviving. The miracle of the age wasn't the rare cure that worked, but the sheer stamina of people who lived their whole lives sick, sore, and always tired, and still found the strength to keep civilization moving. When you picture religion in the so-called Dark Ages, you probably see monks chanting in serene cloisters, or peasants kneeling dutifully before towering cathedrals. Hollywood likes to make it seem mystical, mysterious, maybe even comforting. A steady rhythm of bells and candles guiding weary souls through uncertain times. In truth, religion wasn't a gentle background melody. It was more like the medieval equivalent of a push notification that never turned off. Bells rang constantly, holy days interrupted work schedules, fasting rules dictated meals, and at the end of it all, the one thing you could never escape was guilt. You weren't just working for survival, you were also working overtime to keep your soul out of hell. Let's start with time. Your day wasn't just divided into sunrise and sunset, it was divided into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, tercellus, sext, none, vespers, and compline. If you were a monk, you followed these strictly, waking in the middle of the night to chant psalms before stumbling back to your straw mattress. If you were a peasant, you still lived by the rhythm of church bells, which marked the hours and reminded you that yes, God was watching, even while you were ankle-deep in manure. Then there were feast days. Today we complain about too few holidays. In medieval Europe, you might have 100 holy days a year. That sounds like a generous vacation plan, until you realize most of them were fasting days, prohibiting meat, dairy, or even eggs. Imagine being told you get the day off, but also you're not allowed to eat much, and you still need to show up for endless church services. The medieval calendar wasn't designed for leisure, it was designed for control. Confession added another layer. Imagine trying to remember every wrong thought you'd had in the past month, then whispering them nervously to a priest who might scold you, fine you, or assign penance. Did you work on a holy day? Did you gossip about your neighbor's cow? Did you swear after stubbing your toe on a plow? Congratulations, that's 3 Ave Marias, 2 Paternosters, and possibly a fine if the priest thinks you're slacking. Guilt became a second job, and it never paid well. And then there's tithing, the 10% tax to the church. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. A chunk of your harvest, income, or labor belonged to God's representatives. Fail to pay, and you risked excommunication. Pay faithfully, and you still risked famine if your field underproduced. Religion wasn't optional, it was mandatory membership in the most powerful subscription service in history, and unlike Netflix, you couldn't cancel. Even nobles weren't exempt. A lord might build a chapel, fund a monastery, or endow a pilgrimage to secure divine favor, but every donation was also a political calculation. Give too much, and your estate suffered. Give too little, and your rivals whispered about your lack of piety. You weren't just managing land, you were managing heaven's opinion of you, as filtered through a bishop who probably wanted a new roof for his cathedral. Speaking of cathedrals, those breathtaking stone giants were built on exhaustion. Decades, sometimes centuries of labor went into them. Generations of masons, carpenters, and laborers hauled stone, carved figures, and erected scaffolding, often with little idea of when or if the building would be finished. To walk inside as a peasant must have been awe-inspiring, yes, but also a reminder, all that beauty had been paid for by the aching backs of people just like you, who probably never got a comfortable pew to sit in. And don't forget superstition. Saints were everywhere. Each town had its relics, each relic had its miracles, and each miracle required a donation. Lose a cow? Pray to St. Anthony. Toothache? Try St. Apollonia. Bad weather? Someone probably annoyed St. Medard. The church calendar was crowded with saints' days, processions, and rituals, each one demanding candles, offerings, or attendance. You weren't just surviving the physical world, you were surviving the spiritual bureaucracy. Monks, too, weren't exactly serene. Their lives were regimented, repetitive, and often grueling. Hours of chanting, hours of copying manuscripts, hours of fasting. Yes, they preserved learning and built libraries, but they also lived under constant surveillance, with rules about when to speak, what to eat, how to dress, even how to sleep. It wasn't a life of peaceful contemplation. It was the medieval equivalent of a 24-hour corporate internship, with God as the boss, and no chance of promotion. And yet, religion wasn't all burden. It offered structure, community, and meaning in a world that otherwise felt endlessly tiring. Bells gave rhythm to the day. Festivals broke the monotony of work. Pilgrimages gave people a chance. However rare, to travel and see new places. Faith provided a narrative. All this exhaustion wasn't meaningless. It was part of a divine story. Whether or not you believed, you were part of that rhythm. It was exhausting, yes, but also binding. So no, the Middle Ages weren't dark because people lacked faith. If anything, they were blindingly bright with it. The church was everywhere, in your schedule, your meals, your wallet, and your fears. It wasn't a gentle candle in the dark. It was a spotlight you couldn't escape, always reminding you of your sins, your obligations, and your unpaid tithe. In the end, you didn't just collapse into bed at night from physical labor. You collapsed under the invisible weight of guilt, duty, and divine expectation. And as the church bells rang again at dawn, you rose not only to face another day of work, but another day of God's endless to-do list. If you wanted a break from the daily grind, religion provided one, but not the restful kind. Pilgrimage was the great escape, and it carried all the promise of spiritual renewal, alongside all the aches of a bad pair of boots. To walk from England to Santiago de Compostela in Spain might take months, maybe years, through rain, mud, and bandit country. Each mile was penance. Each blister was a prayer. By the time you reached the shrine, limping and sore, the miracle was not only the relic you'd come to see, but the fact that your legs still worked. Pilgrimage was less about escape from exhaustion and more about sanctifying it. And yet thousands went. They pinned badges to their cloaks, bought scallop shells to prove their devotion, and trudged on. Pilgrims were a walking economy. Taverns and inns sprouted along the routes, selling straw beds and thin stew to weary souls. Monasteries offered hospitality, sometimes free, sometimes for a donation. But even here, comfort was minimal. You shared space with strangers, endured snores and fleas, and prayed your purse was still with you in the morning. Salvation was expensive, and it charged by the night. Then there were the Crusades, pilgrimages with weapons. Preachers promised spiritual rewards for anyone willing to march east and wrest Jerusalem from Islamic control. It was billed as holy glory, but in practice it was one of the most exhausting undertakings in medieval history. Armies tramped across continents in heat, dust, and hunger, leaving trails of disease and debris. Men died not only by the sword, but by thirst, dysentery, and the slow grind of travel. Whatever one thinks of the motives, the physical toll was universal. A crusade was not a glorious charge. It was a slow, punishing march, under banners heavy with dust. Closer to home, monasteries carried their own weary rhythm. They weren't just centers of prayer, they were also Europe's hotels, libraries, hospitals, and welfare offices. A traveller might sleep in their guest house, a sick villager might find herbs in their infirmary, and a poor family might receive bread from their stores. It was charity. Yes, but charity came with order, bells ringing at all hours, rules for silence, rules for speech, rules for posture. A monk's life was regulated down to the position of his hands in prayer, and if you strayed, there was penance. Monastic life wasn't peaceful withdrawal from the world, it was the world turned into an eternal checklist. Psychologically, religion pressed even harder. Hell was vivid in sermons, fire, demons, endless punishment. Heaven was possible, but it came with conditions, confessions, and payments. Indulgences, donations to the church to shorten your time in purgatory, became a spiritual economy of exhaustion. Work, give, repent, repeat. Salvation wasn't guaranteed, and the fear of eternal punishment kept you awake long after the candle guttered. Imagine lying on your straw mattress, stomach rumbling, ears ringing from church bells, and wondering if a single missed confession meant flames forever. Sleep was never entirely restful. The clergy themselves weren't immune to this fatigue. Priests managed communities, confessed sins, mediated disputes, collected tithes, and still had to keep their own souls in order. Bishops managed land like overworked nobles, writing endless letters and enduring endless politics. Even the Pope, sitting in Rome or Avignon, was less a serene father of Christendom and more the CEO of the largest, messiest corporation in Europe. Every prayer, every ritual, Every act of piety filtered upward through a pyramid of exhausted humans. And yet, in the cracks of this system, faith did bring comfort. The cycle of fasts and feasts, bells and chants, gave life rhythm when days otherwise blurred into endless work. A saint's day meant music, processions, maybe even dancing. A pilgrimage meant new sights and stories. Even confession, for all its weight, offered relief. To speak your guilt aloud, even in fear, was to set it down for a moment. Religion was exhausting, but it was also the glue that held tired communities together. So when you picture the medieval Christian life, don't see it as passive, peaceful devotion. See it as one more arena of labor, spiritual work layered on top of physical work, a holy treadmill no one could step off. The Dark Ages weren't dark because faith blinded people. They were exhausting because faith never let anyone rest. God was everywhere, and everywhere he expected you to keep going. One of the biggest myths about the so-called Dark Ages is that people stayed put, rooted like turnips in their villages, never travelling more than 5 miles from home. The story goes that medieval Europe was a world of isolation, each community sealed off from the next, waiting for explorers to discover the wider world centuries later. But that's not true. People moved, merchants travelled, pilgrims trudged, armies marched, and messengers galloped. You could, in fact, journey across continents in the Middle Ages. The problem wasn't that you couldn't move. The problem was that moving anywhere was exhausting. Start with the roads. Roman highways, once the pride of Europe, had crumbled by the early Middle Ages. A few remained serviceable, but most were pothole-riddled trails clogged with mud in winter and dust in summer. Highway usually meant track wide enough for a cart. If you don't mind breaking an axle every few miles, forget smooth pavement, picture ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel, puddles that became ponds, and bridges made of a few planks balanced over rushing water. Now imagine travelling those roads, on foot, which is how most people moved. You might manage 15 miles on a good day. That's if the weather cooperates, your shoes hold up, and you're not robbed along the way. Horses sped things up, but horses were expensive, and they needed feeding, grooming, and resting. Carts and wagons were slower, prone to break down, and impossible in some terrain. Every journey was a gamble. Would you make it in one piece, or would you limp back home with blisters and no cartwheels? And then there's the company. Roads were rarely empty. Merchants carried goods. Pilgrims shuffled along with staffs and shells. Beggars tagged behind, and bandits lurked in the woods. Safety was always in numbers. A lone traveller was a target, which meant if you set out on a pilgrimage to Santiago or Rome, you'd often find yourself in a human caravan. Strangers walking together, sharing food, complaining about blisters, and sleeping in whatever huts, barns, or monasteries would take them in. It was communal, yes, but also cramped, noisy, and very, very tiring. Merchants knew this life best. They hauled salt, wool, wine, and grain across regions, often for weeks or months. Trade fairs like those in Champagne drew crowds from all over Europe. Imagine tents, stalls, and shouting in half a dozen languages, the air thick with the smell of fish, leather, spices, and sweat. Exciting, yes, but exhausting too. For every sack of profit, there was a night spent on a flea-infested straw mat, wondering if your goods would be stolen before morning. Communication wasn't much easier. If you wanted to send a message, you didn't dash off a text. You hired a messenger who trudged or rode across the same miserable roads. Delivery times varied wildly. A week if you were lucky, months if not. Weather, illness, or robbery could delay or erase your letter entirely. By the time your message arrived, the situation might have changed so much it no longer mattered. Exhausting? Absolutely. And yet, people still travelled long distances. Pilgrimages to holy sites pulled thousands from their homes. Crusades marched armies across continents. Traders from Venice sailed to Byzantium and beyond. Norsemen rode across the North Atlantic, touching Iceland, Greenland, even North America. Contact with the Islamic world and Asia brought silk, spices, and stories that reshaped Europe. The medieval world wasn't isolated. It was interconnected by a spiderweb of grueling, exhausting journeys. Even sea travel, supposedly faster, had its price. Ships were cramped, smelly, and at the mercy of weather. Sickness spread quickly in tight quarters. Food rotted, water turned foul, and storms could toss you like a toy. Mariners sang prayers as often as they sang songs. because survival felt more spiritual than nautical. When you reached port alive, it felt like a miracle worth celebrating. But here's the surprising part. Despite the hardships, people kept moving. They endured the blisters, the robberies, the storms, because travel offered opportunities: trade, profit, salvation, escape. If your village was suffocating, the road was at least a possibility. It was exhausting, yes, but it was also a reminder that the medieval world wasn't as small as the myth suggests. People were tired, but they were never still. So no, the Middle Ages weren't isolated in ignorance, cut off from the wider world. They were woven together by roads, rivers, and sea routes that carried goods, people, and ideas across enormous distances. The catch was that every mile cost sweat, blisters, and sleepless nights. To live in that world wasn't to be trapped in one place. It was to know that you could move, but only if you had the stamina to survive the road. The phrase Dark Ages is catchy, but it's also misleading. It wasn't even a term invented by the people who lived then. It was a label applied centuries later, mostly by scholars of the Renaissance, who wanted to flatter themselves. Imagine looking back at your grandparents and saying, "Wow, those were the dim years, but luckily we've figured things out now." It's history written with smugness, and it's stuck. Petrarch, a 14th century Italian poet, is often credited with popularizing the term. He thought of his own time as an age of renewal after centuries of decline, and to make that renewal look brighter, the years before had to look darker. Renaissance thinkers painted the Middle Ages as a 1,000-year intermission, culture on pause until they themselves arrived on stage. Convenient, flattering, and not entirely accurate. The Enlightenment doubled down on this. Philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries saw the Middle Ages as a time of superstition, ignorance, and clerical control. They preferred to highlight their own age of reason, so they cast the medieval centuries as the opposite: unreason, darkness, fatigue. But this wasn't truth, it was branding, and branding is powerful. Once the label Dark Ages stuck, it became a shorthand for misery, ignorance, and gloom. But let's reconsider. Were they dark compared to Rome? Maybe in some ways. The aqueducts weren't flowing like before, cities shrank, trade slowed, political unity fractured. But in other ways, the Middle Ages were building new systems Rome never had. Feudal bonds, while exhausting, created networks of obligation that kept communities together. Local economies grew. Agricultural innovations like the heavy plough and three-field system increased yields. Cathedrals rose where Roman temples once stood. If you judge by monuments, the light never really went out. It just flickered differently. Other cultures certainly didn't see Europe as the center of the universe. To the flourishing Islamic world with its libraries in Baghdad and Cordoba, Europe looked backwards, provincial, perhaps even dirty. Chinese dynasties, rich in invention, probably didn't spare much thought for the tired peasants of France. From the outside, Europe's weariness looked like darkness, but inside, people weren't sitting around in despair. They were working, trading, praying, singing, and trying to survive the day, just like every other civilization. What makes the myth of darkness so stubborn is that exhaustion doesn't leave headlines. Plagues do, crusades do, kings fighting bloody wars do, but the daily grind of survival that slips quietly between the cracks. History remembers drama, it rarely remembers fatigue, and yet fatigue was the real story. Take art. Yes, there were illuminated manuscripts filled with gold leaf and careful script, but those were the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them was an army of anonymous scribes bending over parchment until their backs ached and their eyes blurred. Take cathedrals. Today they are wonders of engineering. Back then, they were workplaces where masons risked their necks on scaffolds, hauling stone day after day. Take trade. We marvel at Venetian ships carrying silk and spices, but every successful voyage meant dozens of exhausted sailors, seasick, sore, and hungry. Behind every bright artifact of medieval life stood an invisible army of the tired. And yet, tiredness is oddly human. It connects us across centuries. Imagine the medieval peasant yawning at dawn, wishing for more sleep, the monk rubbing his eyes during a long midnight vigil, the knight groaning as he straps into armor again, the noble sighing at another endless banquet full of politics, the midwife whispering prayers through another risky childbirth. None of these people thought they were dark. They thought they were busy, overworked, and stretched thin, a feeling you probably know well. The irony is that exhaustion laid the groundwork for renewal. By sheer persistence, medieval people maintained connections, preserved texts, and passed down skills that later ages built upon. Without their tired hands, the Renaissance couldn't have happened. Without centuries of farmers tilling thin soil, merchants trudging along rutted roads, and monks copying crumbling scrolls, the so-called rebirth of culture wouldn't have had anything to rediscover. Progress didn't come from a sudden dawn. It came from a long, sleepless night that never fully ended. And perhaps that's the lesson worth carrying. The Dark Ages weren't dark. They were dimly lit, smoky, weary, and endlessly patient. They remind us that civilizations don't thrive only in bursts of brilliance. They survive in the long stretches of exhaustion, when people keep going, even when there's no grand drama to inspire them. So when you picture the Middle Ages, don't imagine a void waiting for light. Imagine a continent of tired people, carrying civilization like a heavy sack, mile after mile, not glorious, not tragic, just persistently human. And if you listen closely across the centuries, you can almost hear them mutter the same thing you've probably whispered at the end of a long week: I need a nap. And that, in the end, is what the Dark Ages really were. Not dark, just tired.